What's wrong with the Russian invasion is that it lacks a just cause, which is the first requirement of permissible warfare. A just cause is an aim that is sufficiently important, and it has to be a justification, and it has to be an aim of the right sort to justify all the violence that war involves. And in this case, the Russians have given a couple of pretexts for the war. They have said that the war is, on the one hand, an instance of humanitarian intervention. It's an intervention in Ukraine to protect people there from their own government. They say that it is necessary in order to protect separatists and others in the eastern regions of Ukraine from what they have described as a genocide against those people. And Putin has said that the aims of the war include demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine. And he has produced no evidence for this. I mean, he's told some lies on through the Russian state media, but there's no evidence for these claims. This can't possibly be considered a humanitarian intervention. And if you look at what the people are doing in Ukraine right now, nobody is rushing to welcome the Russian liberators. So that's just a completely threadbare pretext based on lies that have been circulated through the Russian media. The other claim is that it is a war of defense against Western Europe and Europe in general. And there is something that Russians can reasonably believe that supports something like that view, namely that they fear that if Ukraine unites itself too closely with the NATO countries and becomes a NATO member or something of that sort, there could be short-range nuclear missiles deployed on Ukrainian territory, which would pose a serious threat to Russia. But there is no threat of that. There's no immediate threat of Ukraine to Russia. Ukraine was posing no threat to Russia whatsoever. That's just transparently clear. Doesn't have anything remotely like the power to hurt Russia. And if Russia is worried about Ukraine joining NATO, this is the kind of matter that must be pursued at this stage through diplomacy. This is what diplomacy is for. And every government in Western Europe and the government of the United States are sensitive to the concerns of the Russians about Ukrainian membership in NATO and that kind of thing. It's not the sort of thing that it's necessary to go to war to deal with. So it seems to me that the real aims of the war include the establishment of the Ukraine as a buffer zone between Russia and other European countries. But as I say, that kind of concern could be satisfied in other ways than going to war. And the real aim of the war, it seems to me, is just to expand Russian power and control, and thereby to expand the power and control of the Russian elite. I think the justification for military aid to Ukraine is analogous morally to the justification for handing a weapon to an innocent person who's about to be murdered by an unjust aggressor. You're assisting innocent people in defending themselves against unjust harm. Of course, military aid has to be handled in a careful way to avoid the risks of escalation. I myself think it's perfectly clear that direct military intervention by any other country in the world to assist Ukraine resist the aggression of the Russians would be justified were it not for the threat of escalation to nuclear war. So I think it's clearly morally unjustified for any country to intervene, to go to the aid of Ukraine, at least any European country or the United States. And that's because of the threat of escalation to nuclear war, which is a threat that Putin has made very explicit. Economic sanctions are another matter. They're different. It seems to me that they are probably intended to have two purposes. First purpose of military sanctions, and arguably the most important purpose of military sanctions, economic sanctions, is to weaken the power of the government and the elites. It hurts the oligarchs, it hurts Putin. I mean, what these people want, as I said before, is power. And their power is diminished if the economic power of their state is correspondingly diminished. So the idea is to make it against the interests of the people who are responsible for launching this war to continue the war, by crippling the institutions that these people govern, that give them the power that they have and that they want to retain and expand. So in that way, it seems to me, economic sanctions are entirely justified. They are being imposed mainly to hurt people who are morally liable to be hurt in this way, as a means of forcing them to, or trying to force them to stop what they're doing. But there's another purpose of sanctions, and that is to put pressure on ordinary citizens in Russia. So I don't doubt that economic sanctions are partly intended to cause some hardship to ordinary civilians. So they are intended in part to harm civilians. Insofar as the intention of the sanctions is just to hurt the elite in Russia who are directly responsible for the invasion, the harm to civilians is just an unintended side effect. And many moral theorists think it's easier to justify harming innocent people as a side effect than it is to harm innocent people as a means of manipulating other people. If we impose economic sanctions, we might be imposing them intentionally as a means of inflicting comparatively minor harms on civilians in Russia, in the hope that that will put pressure on those civilians themselves to protest what their government is doing. So we might do that, inflicting harms on Russian civilians, when I believe they have a clear duty to protest what their government is doing. We either do that, or there's a greater risk of real harms, lethal harms, physical bodily harms to very large numbers of Ukrainians. And in those circumstances, it seems to me that Russian civilians have no legitimate complaint if they suffer from economic sanctions directed against their country because of what their government is doing. So they do bear some responsibility for protesting against what their government is doing and putting pressure on their government to stop. I think it is the duty of every Russian citizen who's capable of it to make some form of protest against this. And the more of them join together, the less risk there is to any single one of them. Just the other day, there were 100,000 people assembled in protest in Berlin. It's 100,000 people in one European city. There should be 1 million people in the streets of Moscow right now. If there were 1 million people in the streets of Moscow right now protesting what the government is doing, there'd be nothing that the government could do to suppress those protests because the numbers would be too large. And the government would be forced to stop. Now, that would be unprecedented, of course, but people do go into the streets and protest what their government is doing. And it's hard to say, I mean, it's hard for me in the safety of Oxford to say they have a duty to go risk being arrested and abused by the Russian police, put in jail, beaten, whatever happens to people who defy the government in Russia, But insofar as the costs to these individuals would not be as great as those I've just mentioned, I think they have a duty to protest this in the same way that Americans had a duty to protest the war in Vietnam. Americans had a duty to protest the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All people have strong moral reasons to try to prevent other people, even if they are total strangers, from being murdered and enslaved, especially if one can do so at relatively low cost to oneself. They should be pressuring their governments to accept as many refugees as come to their borders from Ukraine. My sense is right now that Great Britain is being shamefully selfish in not admitting as many Ukrainians to this country as need to come here. I do think we should all be pressing our governments and any other institutions we are related with to denounce what's happening and to strengthen economic sanctions and accept refugees and provide for these refugees whatever they need. And I would emphasize that this is not just a matter of morality. It's first and foremost a matter of morality, but it's also a matter of self-interest. Because what the Russians are doing right now is making the world as a whole a much less safe place than it used to be. They're reestablishing a kind of Cold War hostility that was absent for a while when during the Gorbachev era and afterwards. There was a period of rapprochement and dramatic lessening of tensions, greatly reduced the risk of nuclear war. And Putin is reintroducing all of that now. So it's a matter of self-interest that everyone in the world oppose what he's doing. He's destabilizing the world order, destabilizing and undermining international law, everything. They are media organs that bear great responsibility for what is happening precisely because they have collaborated with the Russian elites in making this war possible by distributing these lies that provide the pretexts for the war. So they should certainly be blocked. There are various justifications for this. I mean, the main one is that these media organs have been instrumental in distributing to everyone the lies that Putin has been telling them. I saw briefly on the New York Times on my computer a short little video of people being interviewed in the streets in Russia, and they were just saying, we've got to help these people in Ukraine, you know, who are being so badly mistreated by their government and so on. They believe these lies, just like Americans believed and still believe all the lies that Donald Trump told them. You know, 10 a day, 10 major lies every day from Donald Trump. These people have, this is really quite unprecedented. To me, it is extraordinary that in a world in which there is easier access to the facts than people have ever had in the history of the world, people, vast numbers of people in the United States and in Russia believe things that are complete fantasies. They believe the lies that these powerful people tell them. And these powerful people can tell these lies, and the lies can be exposed, but somehow people believe them anyway. In my view, this is just my own view, in effect, every act of war in an unjust war is a crime. everything that Russian soldiers are doing right now, even individual self-defense by Russian soldiers, is criminal. But I remember seeing reports that some of the Russian invaders were putting on the uniforms of the Ukrainian military and going about in the streets of the cities that they have been attacking, and taking advantage of people's belief that they were Ukrainians rather than Russians to be able to go about shooting and killing people. Now, that's a war crime that's known as perfidy. It's deception for the purpose of blurring the distinction in certain ways between combatants and civilians for military advantage. That's definitely a war crime. The use of high-tech weapons may alter the ways in which the relevant principles apply. I'm not sure exactly how, but they don't make a difference to what the rights and the wrongs of the situation are. Basically, as I said a moment ago, my view is that in a war that is unjust, a war that has no just aim, no act that a soldier does in pursuit of those aims can possibly be permissible. Everything they do is morally impermissible. And it astonishes me in this case that ordinary Russian soldiers are obeying orders the way they are. It's a very, very sad reflection about human nature. How can they believe that they're not just going to harm and kill innocent people? There's a convoy 40 miles long of Russian tanks that's presumably intended to encircle Kyiv and lay siege to this city. How can they believe that there's a justification for doing that to civilians in this city who've done nothing to pose a threat to Russia? And yet there they all are, obeying orders, doing what they're told. I and a number of other people who have written about the ethics of war in recent years have said that it's the responsibility of soldiers to determine for themselves, to make sure that the war in which they are fighting is one that really can justify the killing that they are likely to do. And it doesn't seem to me that any of these Russian soldiers has bothered to have any thoughts about what they're doing. Again, it just amazes me that these people can just serve as, in effect, high-tech weapons in the hands of Vladimir Putin. That they can just go off and kill people like little, as if they were just robots programmed to do this, and not human beings and moral agents who should be careful about going off somewhere and killing people they don't know. I don't know. The whole thing just has me very distressed and depressed. This is a warning to us all, everywhere in the world. And what's happening in Russia with Putin is happening in a lot of other countries. We have to resist this kind of authoritarianism that gives people like Putin the power to launch aggressive wars and have everybody repeat the lies that he's told them, and have soldiers go off and do all and commit these murders without any qualms of conscience. These are sad days for the world right now, and we have to realize that we are all involved in this. This is a threat to all of us, not just from Putin, but from within our own societies. We have aspiring Vladimir Putins among us.